Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video I want to talk mainly about the mini budget that was released by the UK government probably nearly 2 weeks ago. The furore from that mini budget has still not died down. And there's been a lot of noise, a lot of political noise. People have talked about tax rates, they talk about removing the cap on bankers' bonuses, energy caps and so on and so forth. I'm not going to focus too much on that part of it. I'm going to approach this in a way that I would approach a negotiation, which is very much to focus on the objectives. Because at the end of the day, the objectives of this mini budget was to generate growth in the UK economy. Now, journalists unfortunately are not particularly intelligent when it comes to rather specific matters. Perhaps I'm being unfair, but they're not specialists, is perhaps a better way of phrasing it. So what that means is they've been making a lot of noise recently about taxes and budgets and infighting. But I've seen very little actual analysis to say, will this mini budget actually generate growth in the economy? And this is an important question for me. This is the sort of thing I do day in, day out whenever I'm going into a negotiation. I am trying to focus on, is what is being agreed, negotiated, going to achieve the objective? What are the flaws in this particular approach? What are the things we can do to mitigate those flaws? And I'm not seeing any of that conversation right now. So I'm going to take a stab at it in this video. Now, also, just to caveat before I proceed, my economics is a bit rusty. I've not used it for quite a long time, although I do follow things. So I am sure there'll be plenty of people with good economics background that will spot various little details that I might get wrong. That is fine. Have right at it. Please do put any corrections, comments, and so on in the comment box below. Also, to highlight to people, for those who are not familiar or haven't seen me mention this before, when I do these videos, they are not scripted. I put together the presentation, think about it very quickly, and then within minutes of concluding the presentation, I will usually go straight into recording, and I do it in one take. Now, yes, you can make an argument that I could considerably improve my videos by preparing longer and better. That is absolutely true. But I do it this way for two deliberate reasons. One is I'm busy, I don't have a lot of time to prepare. And the second is I'm using these videos as a means of improving my improvisation skills. When it comes to negotiation, I am very good at preparing and launching a position from a position of strength from having prepared. I am not traditionally strong at improvising. So I am using these videos as a means of improving my skills in that respect, as well as hopefully helping other people understand some of the things that can help make a good negotiator. So for anyone new to this channel, I'm a professional negotiator with over 10 years of experience. I use this to teach people how to dive into issues, how to critically analyze something in order to establish a negotiation position, shall we say. And in this scenario, we are going to look at the government position because they are negotiating for our votes, and therefore understanding what it is they tell us and what it is they are actually achieving is very much important in any democratic process, in my view. So to start with, I thought I'd just do a bit of a quick recap in a sort of a bit of an ad hoc way actually about what it is required to have economic growth in an economy. And there's some fundamental ingredients. Most economists pretty much agree on this sort of stuff. It doesn't matter your political persuasion. They tend to agree that these things are important for any government trying to generate growth. So an obvious one to start with is access to money. People, companies, government, local and central, whoever, they all need access to money to spend it on things in order to generate growth. No money, no wealth usually tends to hamper the ability for anyone to actually carry out any growth. So that is important. And this government, the UK government, focuses a lot on that sort of thing, but they don't tend to explain it very well. The next thing to talk about is access to human capital. Obviously, you need people. People are essential for any business, and thus essential for any economic growth. You need access to a wide pool of people. You might want very cheap people who will do lots of mundane tasks, but will obviously are essential. Robots have not taken over the world yet. So therefore, you need, many economies do rely on cheap labour. Many economies, and the UK is certainly no exception, also relies on very expensive, high-skilled labour to conduct a range of complex and technical tasks. So it is important to understand that for an economy to grow, it needs access to that labour, the right sort of labour in the right quantities. And so that should be an important feature of any budget. Another thing that's important to understand for economic growth is that individuals and companies need access to infrastructure or enablers. So roads, rails, airports, on one element, that's obvious means, if you're a company, you need access to those things. You may also want, well, it's also well known that other enablers are just as important. So healthcare, clean water, lots of food, good education for the workforce, so on and so forth. So all these things are essential in any economy that wishes to grow. If you don't have proper investment, proper infrastructure, even proper bureaucracy, dare I say it, then your growth is hampered by those deficiencies. So it's important to bear that in mind. What else? So, here where we talk some of the more interesting things. Reduce costs. And let's take energy as a classic example. Energy costs companies, especially companies with high energy needs, particularly manufacturing. If you reduce the cost of energy to those companies, they may conduct more activities because it's cheaper to do so. Now there is of course a bit of an element of unintended consequences here, that you can have increased inefficiency as well. But by and large, reducing the cost of inputs to various sectors is usually seen as a good thing. So taking a bit of an example with the energy, if the UK government nationalised the entirety of the UK energy grid and basically drove down the cost to a very low level, let's say the UK government subsidised it, then what that means is that the cost of energy to all the companies and individuals is massively reduced. Thus they will use more energy. They might do more manufacturing, they might do more travelling, whatever it is that they do that creates economic activity. Of course, what that means is the cost is passed more elsewhere, into the taxpayer, for example. But in that scenario, the government does create economic growth by reducing the cost of energy for everyone. Conversely, sometimes you can get economic growth from things increasing in costs, and oil is a classic example of this. Now, the value of oil itself increases wealth, perhaps, for the companies involved, not necessarily economic growth. The economic growth results from those companies realizing that oil has increased in value and thus going for more oil fields. So more production, basically, because of course it becomes more worthwhile to drill for more oil because it is worth more, and thus they get a return of investment on that on that building, the drilling that they do. So sometimes the increase in commodities prices can also create economic growth, but not always. The increase itself doesn't do it. It's the economic activity it generates to support it that creates the growth, and it's important to understand that distinction. And the final thing I'm going to mention here is the movement of money. Now, economists usually refer to this as the velocity of money. This is something that isn't talked about enough. I'm just going to say movement of money here to keep it simple for people. And let's use an example. Let's imagine, good old 18th century Britain, which was a very, very wealthy country, not least because it stole a lot of gold off the Spanish. Spanish were obviously taking the gold off from Latin America, and British pirates and privateers were ransacking, Spanish ships. So the UK ends up with a vast pool of gold, locks it away in the vault. So that makes the UK, of course, a very wealthy country. But that in itself did not actually generate economic activity. That is because all that gold is locked in vaults. It's not generating anything. People aren't doing anything with that gold. It's just sitting there. So this is why economists are very interested in the movement of money, because money moving around an economy is absolutely critical to creating jobs, to creating growth. So to use another different example, if you pay a builder to do some improvement to your house, that builder has done some economic activity beneficial to you in the house. But then, of course, the builder will take the money that you have given them and they'll pay their suppliers. They'll pay their labourers. The suppliers will also pay their labourers. All those labourers will go to the shops. They will buy shoes or TVs or clothing or other things, which allows those shops to pay their staff. That is the movement of money. It is money that actually circulates around the economy and is not locked down somewhere. And it is important to understand that, because for any government that wishes to create economic growth, it needs to have more movement of money. More wealth that goes into the economy but doesn't move does not create economic growth. So here I want to focus on the announcement in the mini budget about the stamp duty freezes. Now, I'm not going to argue that this is not beneficial to individuals. So for first-time buyers, this is good news. For anyone who is planning on buying a house, not paying less stamp duty is, of course, good news to you. However, the government needs to take a wider view. The government needs to understand what is good for the economy as a whole. So I'm going to slightly challenge a little bit what other people might be saying, that this is a good part of the budget. Because my perspective here is that you have to make a distinction between what is good for the individuals and what is good for the economy as a whole. And so I slightly question, how beneficial is this to growth? There's two ways I want to do that. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is the question of who do banks prefer to lend money to? So let's imagine a bank has a choice. This is not strictly speaking true in today's economy, but just go with this. So imagine the bank has a choice. The bank can lend money to a home buyer like yourself. You will put that money against a fixed asset that appreciates in value, the home, and you will be paying that bank monthly interest rate payments. That is guaranteed income for that bank, and that is money that is secured against a valuable asset, in this case, a house. Let's imagine instead of doing that, the bank has another choice. It can lend that money to a startup, and that startup will buy property, will buy machinery, will employ people, and will try and do something innovative and beneficial to the economy, the local economy. So of course that can create jobs, that will create economic activity. But the bank doesn't care about that. The bank is not the government. The banks, it cares about the risks against the money they have lent. Now of course, by lending that money to a risky startup, they will charge a higher rate. So they should get a higher return. But they will be keenly aware that that money is at risk. Whereas in contrast, giving that money to a homeowner, or home purchaser I should say, in a property market that is constantly going up, is much less risky, as long as they've done the proper due diligence on the ability of the home buyer to actually pay them back. But if all goes wrong, they can just seize the property to get the money back. When all goes wrong, when a company fails, well, there's very little usually to seize back. Quite often the bank would make a loss. So in that context, there's a couple of interesting things to think about. The UK in recent decades has had a massive investment problem. And I'm talking about investment in R&D, into starting up companies, into doing things that create economic wealth and activity. Let's look at Silicon Valley as a contrast to this. One of the reasons why Silicon Valley is so successful isn't just because it got a bunch of crazy people with, high-tech ideas and so on, but their access to money. Silicon Valley is the place you go to with a wacky idea because you're likely to find somebody willing to give you a large amount of money to try it out. The UK economy, in contrast, is not like Silicon Valley. The banking sector of the UK doesn't operate that way. It's a very risk-averse banking sector. So it is rather striking that for the last few decades, R&D investment in the UK had been very poor, and got even worse in 2016 and the Brexit vote, whilst at the same time, maybe coincidentally, maybe not, property values have continued to go up. So in that sort of landscape, what is happening is the banks feel happier to lend money to those buying properties than they do to companies creating economic activity. Maybe. So hold that thought. Let's go to another example, and this is where I have the question of what is an economically valuable investment. So let's imagine you are the home buyer. You got money, whether with a mortgage or not, and you are going to buy a property with it. Now, if you intend to live in that property, then, that's great and lovely for you, of course. You move into the property, you've got some costs to cover, the bills, the insurance, any maintenance costs that property requires, and so on. But the point is, you don't get any economic benefit. You don't get any income out of that property. You might get future capital growth. When you eventually move out of that property, you sell it, and hopefully you will sell it for a lot more than you purchased it, so you've made a gain. But in the entire time that you're living in that property, you're not making money out of it. Quite the opposite, really. The property is costing you money. But when you stack that up against renting, then you can clearly make the case that it is more beneficial to have a mortgage and own the property than it is to pay someone else rent. So let's flip this the other way. Let's say when you're buying your property, you're not buying it for yourself. You're now buying it as a rental property. Now you have certain costs that you have to meet. You also have certain obligations, legal obligations that you have to meet, particularly to tenants. But the point is, that same property is now generating you income. It is creating economic activity as opposed to you just living in it. So this is one of the things you slightly need to understand when it comes to the UK property market, is how much economic activity does it create? Yes, it creates a housing market. Yes, that housing market has value. But how beneficial is that to the wider economy, particularly if there is opportunity cost of the banks preferring to lend money to the housing market rather than to companies that might generate economic activity? So this comes back to the whole question then. Is house ownership good for you and the economy? So we're ignoring the issue, of course, of the rapid increase in mortgage interest rates. Park that to the side for now, as we'll come back to that later. But the position I'm putting here is that by increasing stamp duty threshold to try and encourage more people to buy properties, the government is not increasing wealth in the economy. I refer you back to my previous example of talking about when Britain used to steal all that gold. Made it a wealthy country, didn't necessarily create lots of economic activity. So you can view it in the same way in terms of property. It's also a bit worse than that, because the UK property market is perhaps perceived to be somewhat inflated in value. It's been accelerating at a very high pace. And one of the main reasons for that, there's lots of money, but the main reason, there's not enough property. So the problem with this stamp duty increase is that all it does is it encourages a housing market bubble to increase. It encourages property values to go up. It doesn't create more properties. The act of creating more properties is what would create economic growth. And that is the biggest problem I have with the stamp duty to change in the mini budget. So let's move on. Let's look at how does money help an economy? Because we established that property in some ways, beneficial it might be to individuals, is sort of slightly dead money. It doesn't move around the economy. So what can help money? What can move around the economy and generate growth? We can break it into certain top level categories. Capital investment. So you can invest in a new factory and you're not going to get immediate return. It's going to take a while. But the whole point here is that you put money into something that will generate future growth. So we have to ask, what in the budget is going to increase capital investment? Because at the moment, I'm not seeing much there, to be honest. Let's look at something else. The purchase of goods and services. This is one of the things that people need to understand about developed economies. They tend to grow because people go out shopping. People go and buy things. They go and pay for services. They go and pay for hairdressers or builders. They go and buy TVs or shoes or clothes or whatever. All of that is increased economic activity. However, right now the UK is widely believed to be in a recession. So all of that goes down. Purchasing goes down. People become cautious. They don't spend as much money. So I ask the question, what has the mini budget actually done to encourage people to go out and spend more money? Now I know what some people are going to say. Well, they reduced the tax rate. That may be true. And in other scenarios, that may well increase the purchase of goods and services. But the problem is, in an environment where mortgage rates are going up, where energy costs are going up massively, then of course it doesn't increase. People aren't going to go out and spend money. They're going to take whatever gain they get from reduction in taxation and use it basically to pay their energy bills or food bills or other essentials that have become more expensive. Because here's one of the things I pointed out before, increasing costs reduces economic activity because people have less money available. And I've not seen anything in this budget that corrects that. The other thing is purchase materials. Well, energy is more expensive, food is more expensive, oil is more expensive, everything is more expensive. So again, there's nothing in this budget that reduces the cost of purchasing materials, and that is an absolutely essential input for people or companies to generate more activity. They need to buy things in order to turn it into something else that they could put a markup on it. Now I mentioned taxation a bit before, and I'll come back onto what is the value of taxation in terms of economic growth. Sometimes governments will use taxation to reduce economic activity. This is particularly important in the context of pollution, for example. So let's imagine you've got a factory by the river, factory dumps all its waste into the river. That factory may be reducing its cost by doing that. But instead, what is happening, it is increasing costs downriver. So the taxpayer, for example, essentially picks up the cost of clean-up. So one of the benefits of taxation and regulations is that you can use it to reduce that sort of what economists call negative externality. That is what government is meant to do. They make to make a decision that that activity is undesirable. You can use taxation or regulation to reduce it. But you can also make the reverse decision as a government, that a certain activity is not happening enough and therefore it requires more money. And this is particularly important in the capital investment type of world, when projects are so big that companies are reluctant to take risk on it. That is quite often where a government will use taxation money to kickstart economic growth. So, for example, in the Victorian times in the UK, London had a new sewage system, hugely expensive. But the government decided that it was an expense worth paying and to be paid for via taxation because it would improve the overall health of Londoners. Healthy people can work harder. So that was a benefit to the economy leveraged through taxation. So again, you need to look at the mini budget here and say, is reduction in taxation a good thing? Because what activity is that going to create? And if you take the view that people aren't going to create more economic activity because that is not the right type of environment to do so, then good old-fashioned Keynesian economics tells you that the government steps in and does it. So the government uses taxation to kickstart the economy by investing in things, by spending money. And we're not seeing any of that, of course, in the mini budget. That is not what Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng believe in. So we can rule that out. And then I want to come to the final point here of savings and investments. Now, in a traditional sense, when you save money, you give money to a bank. That bank rewards you by paying you an interest rate, and that bank then goes and lends money to companies. Of course, I used this example when talking about properties earlier. But nowadays, the economy is a bit different. Banks create money. They don't need you to give them money to then go and lend money. They take whatever money they've got and they re-lend it several times over. So people saving money doesn't create the same economic activity that it did. Now, people putting money into investments is a similar sort of argument. If you buy shares in a company, you're essentially giving that company money that they will then use to go and create growth in that company. They might go and build another factory with that money, for example. But the investment market is a very complicated beast. I'm not even going to bother trying to explain it. But what I'm going to say is just holding investment does not necessarily translate to a company spending more money doing economic activity. So the point I'm trying to make here is that when the bank goes and makes cash cuts, whether that's for the general population or whether that is for the top 1% in the country, cutting taxes is only useful if people go out and spend that money. If people take the increased money that the government had given them and they spend it on energy bills or they put it in a savings account, that is not in any way, shape or form going to actually generate more economic activity. It's not going to generate growth. And this is the biggest flaw in the whole mini budget, is that it might give people more money in a theoretical sense, but it doesn't in any way put more money into the economy. It doesn't make money move in the economy. Same with property. Money gets sunk into property, it doesn't move around the economy. So as I like to do, I like to ask questions. This is a tactic or technique I use quite often in negotiations. I ask lots of questions to try and dig into the heart of the issue, try and understand the situation better. So here, let's try and ask some key questions about, regardless of anyone's views about whether they like or dislike the mini budget, has it generated or will it generate economic growth? Will it improve the state of the UK economy? So, does it help improve the flow of money into the economy? Now this is tricky. I've not even talked about inflation so far, nor do I really intend to dig into it. I'm sure people are bored of hearing about inflation by now. But we all know that more money going into the economy creates inflation, and right now inflation is a bad thing. So not a desirable in the context of the UK economy. But regardless of that, if you want growth, you sort of do need a bit of inflation. So we do have to ask the question, has this mini budget improved the flow of money? In theory, yes, in theory, reducing taxation. Unfortunately, reducing the top level of taxation relies on trickle-down economics. That has been a widely discredited theory for a long time. So we'll ignore that. We'll focus more on the 19p sort of percentage tax rate, the lower tax rate. And the trouble is, it doesn't. It doesn't because people don't have that money to spend. They also don't have the confidence to go out and spend it because hard times are coming. What about a reduction in corporation tax? Well, same argument applies. Corporations are facing increased bills, not a particularly good economic prospect, and therefore the flow of money from companies into other activities, into building new factories and so on, well, there isn't going to be an awful lot of that. So I would argue the answer here is no. This mini budget has not improved the flow of money. Does it improve investment? Well, investment confidence even. Well, clearly the answer to that is no. We've seen all the news, we've seen the market crash, so quite clearly investment confidence has not improved as a result of the mini budget, particularly because people don't believe the government and don't know how they will balance the books. So that's clearly a failure. What else might it? Will it improve costs, reduce costs? Now, here's something I do want to focus on a little bit, because the government's message has always been that they need to cut red tape, they need to cut bureaucracy and so on, because this will reduce costs to businesses. Unfortunately, the reverse is actually true. So think about it in certain ways. I previously had talked about negative externalities. Allowing companies to have low standards when it comes to manufacturing goods, for example, not just in terms of pollution, leads to increased costs elsewhere. So let's take a car. If you've got an unreliable car, you have to spend more money repairing it than if you spent a bit more money on a more reliable car up front when you bought it. That sort of argument. So bureaucracy and red tape is meant to be the same. If you do it right, it reduces cost for everyone. It reduces all the negative effects. The other way that good regulation reduces cost is that it creates common standards. And this is what the EU has been about for a long time. The EU spend a lot of money, not necessarily the most efficient way possible, but they spend a lot of money trying to create common standards for everybody. So what this means for a business is that if you certify that your goods meet that standard, you have no further paperwork to prove that your product is safe. People accept it because they trust the standards, they trust the regulations to be enforced properly. So what this means is a reduction in cost to individuals and to businesses because there's less paperwork for them to fill in as a result of good regulations. So when the government promises to remove various regulations, you need to question as to whether this genuinely does improve economic activity and reduce cost. The one thing I will give them when it comes to reducing costs is the energy cap. That was absolutely essential because that increase in cost was simply unsustainable and would have throttled economic activity quite horrifically. Now, of course, there's an argument to be made that the government did this in a very inefficient and wasteful way, but I'm not going to make that argument today. I'm just going to focus on the fact that there is one thing they have done to cut costs for individuals and businesses, and that was the energy cap. But they might undo all of that with their desire to remove regulations and to cut down the civil service, who are meant to create and enforce that regulation. Those are enablers. They're enablers that allow an economy to function. And if you remove the enablers, you create considerably more inefficiency in the economy. And unfortunately, the mini-budget does nothing to address that. So what else can we say? What other questions can we ask? Does it perhaps the mini-budget improve trade? Or the ability to manufacture goods? Well, not really. Nothing there in trade at all. And even though the reduction in corporation tax might be beneficial to manufacturers, it doesn't outweigh all the other problems happening within the economy. And as anybody with half a brain cell already knows, all the Brexit trade deals and the policies and so on that the government have pursued to date have been utterly disastrous for UK trade exports. This mini budget does not address any of those issues. And of course there's another Brexit issue that we're also aware of. That is labour. So has the mini budget in any meaningful way improved access to labour? Well, certainly not at the lower end, at cheaper labour. It hasn't encouraged anybody to come to the UK, work more, pick fruit, vegetables, work in manufacturing, whatever. That small reduction in tax, I suspect, is not particularly enticing to them, shall we say. And the government did make the argument that reducing bankers' bonuses and reducing the top rate of tax abolishing the top rate of tax would create that access to labour people want to come to the UK to gain the benefits of it. Unfortunately, that is a very small number of individuals. And they may personally benefit, but just like the stamp duty, that is not an argument that it is beneficial to the wider economy. And I won't go any further into that, that's been done to death already. But needless to say, the mini budget did not in any meaningful way improve the UK labour market that will help generate economic growth. So, did the mini budget perhaps improve the ability of the population to spend money? Well, again, not really. It did cut energy costs a little bit. There was a minuscule drop in taxation, which would be instantly wiped out by the increase in energy costs and the increase in mortgage rates. So that's a clear no. So in this sort of context, when things go badly, government will usually get the checkbook out and will go and make capital investments. They would go and build roads, schools, look at it like Chinese way. The Chinese did this. They did it quite to excess, actually, to be honest, but that's a different conversation. The point is, did the UK government, in its mini budget, say we're going to borrow this money because that will create something that will generate future growth? And here is the biggest flaw in the whole of the mini budget. This is why the markets went quite crazy and crashed. They gave away a lot of money. They tried to reduce costs. They tried to stop things getting worse. But they borrowed an insane amount of money for no genuine return. There isn't any genuine investment that's going to come out of the mini budget. So take the factory thing. You can grab all your money, you can stick it into your savings account, it will generate a small amount of return. Or you can build a factory, that factory will employ people, manufacture goods, and generate a wider economic return. The government is not doing any of that. And that is why the markets are reacting so badly to the budget. They see it as unsustainable borrowing. So let's wrap this up. First question. What use has the mini budget actually been? Because having looked at all the various different aspects of it, I've not actually seen it deliver any growth. There are no particular levers, there are no enablers. In fact, it's very much a budget that is driven by ideological perspective. And it doesn't matter what your ideology is, there are certain basic things that any competent politician should understand. They should understand that the critical thing that economies require: money, labour, capital, investment, etc. And so the only conclusion really we can draw is that people like Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss will talk about growth a lot, but when you dig in a bit deeper, they actually know very little about what even creates growth. So all their suggestions, all their proposals, and what they think their proposal will do to help kind of rather fall flat, to be honest. It just doesn't stand any scrutiny whatsoever. Which leads me to the next crucial point, which is what people need to understand. Economies grow because people believe economies will grow. If people feel confident in the economy, confident in what the future will bring, they will go out and buy things. They will go and buy property with mortgages. They might even go buy cars with hire purchase agreements and so on. Investors in the market will put money into various ventures and so on and so forth. If all those individuals and corporations do not have confidence, then they won't be spending the money, they won't be investing. And because they're not spending the money and because they're not investing, the economy will slow down. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. And rather unfortunately, the abysmal presentation by the UK government of that mini budget, the absolute lack of any explanation of where the money would come from and the benefit that spending that money would bring, has completely and utterly destroyed any confidence. So by that very act alone, they have prevented any growth from occurring. And the final concluding point that I would like to make is that politicians are very good at taking credit for the work of others. And when it comes to economies, what people often seem to forget, and the media are particularly bad at that, is that it is very easy to wreck an economy quickly. The mini budget alone would seem to demonstrate this. But it's very hard to put in place good policies that will produce good outcomes. There's a lag, quite often quite a few years worth of lag. So as an example of this, when Trump was president in the US, he kept taking lots of credit for the fact that the economy was growing, employment was good, etc., etc. What he was conveniently ignoring was that for the first 2 or 3 years, at the very least of his presidency, all those benefits were generated by the previous president, President Obama, because that's how long it takes for any good policies to make a significant impact on the economy. And of course, we'll never know if his policies were genuinely any good, because then COVID hit and his rather bad decision making quite quickly caused various economic problems. So with that kind of example in mind, we can only wonder whether the start of Liz Truss's prime ministership, with Kwarteng as a chancellor, has had a very immediate and negative impact on the economy, and I fear we could be waiting a very long time for any positive outcomes, if of course we do believe that those policies will generate any. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you've always had that little feeling that there was just something wrong with the budget, but you couldn't quite figure out how to explain it, then I'm hoping all the things I put forward in this video will help you to articulate that argument better and to understand why there are flaws with the budget, and not just to follow the media herd and talk about all the more political things that they wanted to talk about in regard to the budget. So I hope you found this video helpful. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed it.